Okay,
Hi,
well,
everyone. Happy holidays. We're here this evening with historian Charles King and his new book, Every Valley: The Desperate Lives and Troubled Times That Made Handel's Messiah. George Frideric Handel's Messiah is adored by millions. It's performed every year by renowned choirs and orchestras and also in community sings. But this work of triumphant joy was born in a worried age not unlike the one we live in now. At the time, Britain was a place of astonishing creativity, but also the seat of an empire mired in war, enslavement, and conflicts over everything from the legitimacy of the government to the meaning of truth. Sound familiar? Um, this chat is open, and you can use the Q&A for the author questions. Also, the event is closed captioned, and you can enable captioning on your Zoom screen. Charles King is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Gods of the Upper Air, which received the Francis Parkman Prize and the Anna Steele Wolf Award. It was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His other books include Odessa, winner of a National Jewish Book Award, and Midnight in Para Palace. He lectures widely on the international affairs and has worked with broadcast media such as CNN, National Public Radio, BBC, the History Channel, and MTV. And you can catch him on Sunday on CBS Sunday Morning talking about this book. Mr. King's articles and commentary have been published in magazines and newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, Foreign Affairs, the Times Literary Supplement, as well as in leading academic journals. He's a professor of international affairs and the government in Georgetown University, where he has served as chair of both the Department of Government and the Edmund Welsh School of Foreign Service, the world's premier school of global affairs. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, the writer and anthropologist Margaret Paxson. He will be in conversation with two of our favorite Messiah lovers, Board President Bob Parks and author committee member Eileen Parks. Welcome, Charles, Bob, and Eileen.
thank you. Thanks, Sandy.
Nice to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Charles. Peter Conrad in The Guardian said that your book humanizes the Messiah's exalted creators and demonstrates that it's not a pompous manifesto of faith, but of a troubled, desperate quest for consolation. That despite all of the hallelujahs in the Messiah, that what is most moving is the prescription for overcoming personal misery. So that's kind of surprising. You mentioned in the book that it's performed over 200 times every year just in the United States alone.
Yeah.
And, it is you rightly name it one of the greatest pieces of participatory art ever created. Everyone gets involved with the Messiah.
Yeah.
But you found that it was from the age of Enlightenment, and that's not kind of what we take on the surface of things. It's that it's a completely reasonable, very calm time. And what were some of the things that you found in terms of the seeds of the Messiah?
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, it's delightful to be with you. Thanks very much for inviting me, and hello, everybody. Well, you know, because of the status of this piece of music, this work of art in our culture and civilization, we wanted to have a beginning that is, in a way, mysterious and profound and maybe even quasi-divine. You know, the story that is often told is of Handel, this, you know, genius composer with an angel sitting on his shoulder, composing this work of music in 24 days, which is true. He wrote it in 24 days in August and September of 1741. And we want him to be deeply special and sort of alone and inspired. But I've always found that to be a little bit of a betrayal of the work in a way, because this is a thing that requires an entire group of people to perform. And in fact, it's the only piece of music in the classical canon where loads of people from their seats in a sing-along, want to perform. And in doing the research for this book, what I found is that that's very much true to its beginning. And so Every Valley is the story of the many people, but principally five that I focus on in the book, who were at the core of this work's creation. And at the sort of center of those five are two people. One, of course, Handel himself, but the other is this very obscure figure named Charles Jennens, who was in some ways the truest father of Messiah, because it was his idea. He created the text for it, or he assembled the text from biblical passages, and then unbeknownst to Handel, did all of this work and sort of shipped it off to Handel, who then in 1741 composed the music for it. And these two guys were responsible for its creation. So we should really not call it Handel's Messiah, but Handel's and Jennens's Messiah, because they were kind of the George and Ira Gershwin, or the Elton John and Bernie Taupin of the 18th century. And those comparisons are not crazy, actually, because Baroque music, far from being this prim and frilly cuffed kind of very staid music as we might think of it now, it was in some ways the popular entertainment of the day. And so what I wanted to do in Every Valley was really kind of reacquaint people with the rawness and the immediacy and the presence of this music and its message, because when people first heard it, they saw its relevance to them. It's made up of ancient texts and ancient prophecies, but people immediately saw the relevance, which is something that Jennens himself wrote into it.
You came upon all of this a little bit by accident. This is your COVID book.
Yeah, it's my COVID book, exactly.
And you and your wife were cooped up at home in Washington. And in Washington wasn't a great place during COVID. And then January 6th happened.
Yeah.
And so this is a kind of a firmament that you can kind of see back a couple hundred years, and there's a lot of parallels.
Yeah. I mean, it was very much a time kind of out of joint. I mean, not only was there COVID, but then of course the Black Lives Matter protests in DC, which were very big. And then of course January 6th, and we happen to live on Capitol Hill, and so that all unfolded 6 blocks from our house. And for a good part of the better part of a year afterwards, we were very near the kind of the green zone that had been created on Capitol Hill, with 10-foot fencing and razor wire around bits of the Library of Congress and the Supreme Court and the Capitol, a 4-mile fence that, unless you were living in Washington at the time, you wouldn't have kind of known about. And in the middle of all of this, and our family had sort of health issues, and my wife Maggie had a very serious health issue at the time. And so I was trying to, what can we do to feel better in the middle of all of this? And I had bought for Maggie a few years before a Victrola. She's a singer and writer, and I thought, it'd be fun to have a Victrola in the house, one of those wind-up, completely acoustic music reproduction devices. And I thought, somehow, you have these crazy ideas when you're trying to feel better. And I thought, if I could find the oldest recording of Handel's Messiah, which is something that we had always loved, but didn't know particularly well, if I could find the oldest recording of this and put it on that Victrola, this would somehow be some kind of big healing magic, And so found a copy of the 1927 recording, the first full recording in London on eBay, and had it sent to the house, and one thing led to the next. And we put this thing on, and we both just kind of, burst into tears at the opening bars, and just like burst into tears. And so from that moment, I kind of thought, well, I want to follow that emotion in a way and see what the backstory to this is. I was always skeptical of the lone genius Handel story, like nothing's ever created by a lone genius, absolutely nothing. And so that led me on this kind of journey up and down the length of Britain, to Venice, which has a connection to the story, the eastern shore of Maryland, which strangely enough and surprisingly has a connection, and all the way to a windowless room in the British Library, where the music curator brought out from the vault a thing that is never on display, which is the original manuscript of Messiah, which miraculously has survived all these centuries, survived the Blitz, survive. It's there. And to be in the presence of this thing, Handel's actual manuscript handwriting from August and September of 1741, it was remarkable. It was remarkable.
And it was performed for the first time in 1742 in Dublin, of all places. And performed. One of the performers was a singer, an actor down on her luck.
Yeah.
And that's one of the stories.
Yeah. In fact, I was very moved by the story of this woman, Susanna Cibber, who is one of the major characters in the book. In fact, I think of her as being so central to the book that I really wanted a British female older voice to do the audiobook. And we were lucky enough to get Juliet Stevenson, who is just a wonderful British actress, to do the audiobook, which she did really brilliantly. Some people may remember her opposite Alan Rickman in Truly, Madly, Deeply, one of those terrific films from many years ago. And so she kind of portrays almost Susanna Cibber, as it were, looking back on the story of this piece of work that she was involved in the premiere of. But so Cibber, who was born Susanna Arne, Arne, was born in a very modest background in Covent Garden. Her father was an upholsterer. Her mother was a midwife. But she had a talent for the stage, and her parents saw this sort of pretty early on. In fact, her father really wanted the whole family to get into show business right at the time that Italian opera was taking off in London. This is the early age of what will eventually become the West End in London, the theater district that's just getting kind of created as the old city of London is expanding to the west. Handel is in the middle of this world of Italian opera, having immigrated from Germany or what would become Germany via Italy at the time. And the Arne family starts doing their own stage shows, kind of amateurish, family stage shows. And Susanna's father realizes that an even better way of getting into the business is not just to do these sort of amateurish family shows, but to have his daughter marry into the business. And he concocts a kind of relationship between his daughter and a man named Theophilus Cibber. Theophilus was the son of the greatest impresario of the day, a man named Colley Cibber, who was a theater mogul and a poet and a playwright. And so when they get married, from Mr. Arne's point of view, Susanna's father's point of view, this is like golden. Like now the family has really made it through this kind of dynastic marriage into the theater world. But Theophilus turns out to be an absolute nightmare. I mean, he's a horribly abusive husband. He sleeps his way up around a caste. He drinks to excess, and he eventually starts offering what at first are probably just meetings, and then take on a kind of sexual dimension between his wife and wealthy young men who will pay his gambling debts and his bar tab. And this is kind of a real low point in Susanna's life, as you can imagine, but not as low as it will become, because she falls in love with one of these guys that she meets in this way, a parliamentarian's son named William Sloper, very wealthy guy. And Theophilus realizes, oh my God, the fact that his wife is now in love with another man turns out to be an actually very good thing, because he can now sue William Sloper, the man she's having an affair with, for damages. He doesn't want to divorce her, but he can sue this man for alienation of his wife's affection, which he did in 1738 and again in 1739, each time winning a little bit more money from the court. And you can imagine then this, you know, very wealthy seam that Theophilus can mine. He could just keep suing his wife's lover over and over and over again, so long as they stay together. But from her point of view, this is obviously devastating. You know, she's ruined. Like, the most intimate details of her life have been aired in a public courtroom. And so she disappeared from the stage for a couple of years and only pitched up again in Dublin in the autumn of 1741, right about the time that Handel is arriving to stage a series of concerts there. He's looking around for singers the following spring to cast in this new piece of music he's going to premiere. And he asks Susanna Cibber to be a member of the cast. And what's so astonishing about her performance at the premiere is that he gives her some of the most moving arias of the piece, including "He was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief," for anybody who knows the music. And when she sings this, anybody in the audience could have done the kind of gender switch, you know, that she's a person of sorrows, she is acquainted with grief, and it absolutely brings down the house. This person who had suffered beyond belief, who is now singing about the possibility of redemption. And for her, it was a redemption, because she goes on after that to become the most successful, the most well-known, the most highly paid actress of her time.
Redemption comes up over and over in your book,
Yeah.
and it's something that Handel maybe had in the back of his mind. A lot of people had in the back of their mind because of an awful scourge that was happening in that time, that was in the background of everything. That Handel was making a lot of money at this point. He wrote Messiah in his late 50s. And he's a wealthy man, and a lot of that wealth came from a certain source.
Yeah.
Henry Louis Gates said about your book about Every Valley. You've got a great plug from Henry Louis Gates. He says it's exquisite, note for note, page by page. Charles King takes us beyond an imagined enlightenment to the sobering realities of a world that included the horrors of transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned the Enlightenment earlier, and this is such an important component of this book, because, you know, we have an image of the Enlightenment as being about rationality and reason and new theories of government and advances in science, all of which, of course, were part of the 18th century. But this piece of music, Messiah, was born in kind of the shadowy corners of the Enlightenment. It was a time of, you know, increasingly lethal war making. Britain was at war at the time this thing premiered. You know, it was a time of disease and infant mortality. In London at the time, the infant mortality rate was 75%, which is astonishing figure. Every family who was there at the premiere in Dublin who had kids would bury far more children than they ever saw to adulthood, you know. And so people understood the realities of suffering and the immediacy of suffering. And as you point out, beneath all of this, beneath family wealth, beneath the great estates of the time, lay transatlantic enslavement, lay the slave trade. And so I wanted to tell the story of that fact through an individual. And kind of lo and behold, it turns out that there is this remarkable figure named Ayuba Jallow, who pitches up in London in the 1730s. He was a man from West Africa who had been captured and sold into slavery, put to work on a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was sold on the docks of Annapolis, and then tried to escape and was pretty quickly caught. But he happened to come into the acquaintance of a traveling minister and lawyer while he was in jail in Dover, Delaware. And this lawyer, through a translator, realized that Ayuba Jallo was actually from a very prominent Muslim family in West Africa. He spoke multiple languages. He was probably a Hafiz, meaning someone who had memorized the entirety of the Quran. And this traveling preacher was so astonished by this story that he wrote to his captors, wrote to the Royal African Company in London saying, look, you've got this really remarkable figure here. And this was at a time when in the colonies, the racial dimensions of slavery were only just getting written into kind of law, you know. So the great fact of the system of racial enslavement in what would become the United States is that, of course, this had to get created. It was created through specific laws passed by specific colonial assemblies, and then, of course, written into in various forms into the U.S. Constitution. So Jallo then, from that point forward, when his freedom is purchased by his former captors, who they think, I think, at the time that, well, we've got this very literate, well-placed enslaved man who, to their mind, had been enslaved kind of by mistake, if you like, that maybe he can do some work for us if we send him back to West Africa. And so they ship him back to London for several years, for several months in the 1730s. He's kind of the toast of the town, this sort of returned African prince. His portrait is painted by a well-known portraitist from Bath, and it now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's perhaps the first portrait in Britain of a Black man who's painted as a subject rather than a kind of object in the background of a wealthy household, you know, scurrying kind of in the back. And I thought, well, this will be his life that coincides with the creation of this piece of music will be a great way of narrating the reality of enslavement. So Handel, for example, received his paychecks through holding accounts in the Royal African Company. So everybody's implicated in this. Charles Jennens held stock in the South Sea Company, another slaving firm. But what I discovered in the research was in some ways even more remarkable, because I knew that Charles Jennens had been a member of a thing called the Spalding Gentlemen's Society, which was a kind of learned society of the time before the British Academy and other learned societies for gentlemen were created. And so I got a membership list of the Spalding Gentlemen's Society. And wouldn't you know it, 2 lines down from Charles Jennens on the membership list is Ayuba Jallo. And I thought, good Lord, you know, to have on the same historical document the creator of Messiah, the librettist, if you like, of Messiah, and then an actual enslaved man who is his own kind of returning prince, just at the time that Jennens is sitting down to write his own story of a kind of divine returning prince, the story of Messiah. I thought, gosh, this coincidence is just astonishing.
Well, I've been monopolizing the questions. Please, we've got 30 odd people on this Zoom and would love to get some questions. We've touched on a couple of subjects. If we have musical questions or politics questions, please throw them out there. Eileen, anything come to mind?
Well, it's so colorful, and it's got so much history that's familiar with all those fresh new bits like the gentleman you just spoke of. So it makes me and I've been watching a lot of media, like I'm wondering, like, it seems like it'd be a good movie.
Well, you know, from your lips to God's ears, you know, that would, I do think, you know, it's an incredible story of intertwined lives, you know, and I just this, I really wanted to show the ways in which it takes this whole cast of characters. I mean, speaking of a film, how it takes a whole cast of characters to create this thing. And that's so much more interesting. It turns out also to be historically true that this is the way this thing was created, rather than just a story of one guy sitting alone at his composing table thinking all of this up. You know, the other great fact of Messiah is that you listen to enough of Handel's music and you will find plenty of self-plagiarizing in Messiah. You know, um, Handel wrote for the stage. So he's in a way much more like an Andrew Lloyd Webber or Stephen Sondheim than he is like Bach, who is his exact contemporary, of course. They lived in very, very different worlds. Bach is writing a lot for the church. Handel is writing for the stage, you know, Italian opera. He's a showman. And so when he found something that worked, a musical passage, a chordal structure, something, a way of handling an English text, because of course he's not a native English speaker. And so he has a particular ear for passages that sound rhythmic to him in English. He can probably hear that better than a native English speaker could. So in a piece like Zadok the Priest, which a coronation anthem he wrote for the coronation of George II in 1727, and in the Hallelujah chorus, he loves that syncopated rhythm of forever, you know, forever and ever and ever, and it goes on and on and on and on. He loves that. He can hear the syncopation of that thing. And so he'll recycle those whenever he finds them, you know, useful. And so that's why I actually think, you know, I think it would make a magnificent soundtrack for something to go all. In fact, I will tell you, there's also a Spotify playlist that I put together for the book. So if you search playlists on Spotify, Every Valley, it will come up, and it kind of goes all the way through all of the music that I mentioned in the book.
Love Spotify playlists.
Yeah, good.
Jennens and Handel were not religious zealots, did not have a fervent religious, and quite the contrary. It's kind of surprising that the Messiah that has King James text in it.
Yeah.
Jennens did a deep dive on the King James Bible. Why?
Yeah. Well, so that's an interesting dimension of their relationship, is that they were kind of frenemies, you know. Jennens was one of the most important sort of Handel super fans of that time. He was a patron of Handel's. He absolutely loved Handel's music. But he loved it so much and was so sure of himself and so wealthy and so forth that he kind of felt at some point, as he got to know Handel better, that, you know, he kind of took it upon himself to correct Handel's mistakes when he thought he had made a musical mistake. And he started offering him librettos that Handel might want to set. So they did kind of 2.5 major productions together before they ever got to Messiah. So Saul and Israel in Egypt. But the differences between them were really profound. I mean, not only, you know, a very wealthy person and a musician, but they also really differed on religion. So Handel was Protestant kind of in the normal way of the time. He was not particularly devout. It wasn't until the last decade of his life that he started going to services regularly and sort of evinced a real sense of devotion. That's more than a decade after Messiah premiered. So we don't have the sense that he even thought at the time that what he was creating was any kind of act of devotion or of religious fervor. Jennens, by contrast, was quite devout. He was a very high church Anglican, and he was a person who thought that any attempt to rationalize Christianity was a mistake. So the idea of awe and wonder and mystery was sort of central to the way that he saw the world, which is a theme that, of course, you can find throughout then that the texts that he chose for Messiah. And keep in mind that, there's nothing in the text of Messiah that he created that's in the biblical order. It's all in the order that Jennens wanted it to be. And so you're going on this very personal journey that Jennens himself is taking you on, from the first words, comfort ye my people, all the way to that 3-minute long amen at the end. That's Jennens as your kind of guide to the mysteries of Christianity and the narrow kind of understanding of the text. And then more broadly, he's taking you through the reasons to be hopeful in a kind of broken and hopeless world. A final point on this is that the really big divide between the two of them was political. So Handel was, of course, the servant of the British kings, George I and George II. He was court composer and, composed the music for George II's coronation and music for the royal fireworks and the water music, which accompanied George I on a tour up the Thames River. And Jennens, by contrast, was what was called at the time a non-juror. He refused to accept the Hanoverian kings, beginning with George I, as the legitimate government of Britain. He felt the old Stuart kings, who had been deposed in 1688, and then, of course, Queen Anne was a Stuart, but when she died and the Hanoverians came to power in 1714, he thought the country had taken a massive wrong turn politically, and that an illegitimate government was in power. And that was a consequential decision, because he couldn't stand for Parliament, he couldn't take a university degree, he couldn't work in any profession, he couldn't do anything where you had to swear allegiance to the government. And so, there's an interesting subtext throughout the story of how two people who are politically as far apart as you can get in that time. And, this was of great consequence. It was the great political canyon that ran right through the middle of British society, and it would lead to violence in 1745 during the so-called Jacobite rebellion, when the Stuarts try to come back and take over the country by force, and are pretty close to succeeding, had it not been for some strategic decisions that the famous Bonnie Prince Charlie in Scotland made at the time. This was the most consequential political divide of their time. Yet these two people come together on opposite sides and create this kind of monument to the possibility of unity and hope.
Any thoughts, Irene?
Well, you talking about such polarization in that society and what we're dealing with now. I wonder, do you have any juicy tidbits about what life was like for the polarization that was going on with the Jacobites versus
Absolutely. I mean, it was polar. I mean, they felt that sort of Britain in the 1730s and 40s, early 1740s, people at the time thought this was the most polarized society that they could have imagined, right? So political parties have only been really in existence over the last few decades at that point. Society is deeply divided between Whigs and Tories, as they were called, both of which were insults, by the way. Both those labels are insults that the other side created to name their political enemy. We use those terms now, but the origin is a political insult from the other side. And, at stake was who is the legitimate government. And Jennens was a Protestant. And of course, the Stuarts were suspiciously Catholic. James II, when he was deposed, was actually probably Catholic, and of course had baptized his son as a Catholic, and named the Pope as a godfather, just to get rid of any doubts about whether he was Catholic or not. And this was of great consequence, but Jennens felt that the issue was not Protestant versus Catholic. It was a rightly ordered world, a rightly placed sovereign versus this kind of just, oh, well, if we don't like this sovereign, we'll just get another one. And he thought that was just wrong, that you can't do that. There is something that God has ordained in the firmament, and you can't just by human fiat change it. And people were really, really worried about Jacobite conspiracies. And there were both conspiracy theories about what the Jacobites were doing and real conspiracies that the Jacobites, the so-called Jacobites after the Latin name for James, trying to bring back the notional James III from exile in France and later Italy. And then, in 1745, those conspiracies burst out into the open as James III's son, Charles Edward Stuart, or we know him in history, and if fans of Outlander, will know him as Bonnie Prince Charlie, where Bonnie Prince Charlie sails to Scotland from France to launch a rebellion in his father's name. And this is, you don't want to make sort of comparisons across the ages, but this is a shock. This is a military and political shock to the British system, on par with a massive terrorist attack or something like. The country has now been invaded. The people who were these conspirators underground are now bursting out into the open, and they're marching on London. And all of this is taking place only 3 years after Messiah has premiered. So it's all in the middle of this politically contentious moment.
Oh, it's very colorful.
Mm-hmm.
So we're zooming around a lot, but I really recognize the kind of common trope of the young man going off to Italy to find his artistic voice.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a wonderful passage of your book. And he's exposed to oratorio for the first time, all these new forms, all this kind of opening his vista to new art forms.
Yeah, right. I mean, Handel, was not born into a musical family at all. Very much unlike Bach, who was born, almost exactly at the same time, about a month apart, about 100 miles apart, but very, very different family background. Bach is deposited into this family of well-established musicians, and Handel's father was a barber surgeon, as they were called at the time. He's a kind of public health official who will seal off neighborhoods when typhus or the plague are raging. And the plan is for Handel to go into the law or something that will step the family up, financially and in their position in society. But Handel wants to be a musician. He's crazy about music wherever he finds it. And his father finally arranges for lessons with the local organist. And from there, his talent just kind of takes off. He moves from his native city of Halle to Hamburg, where he's working as a second violin in the opera there, and then eventually he goes to Italy, because at this time, so this is the end of the 17th century, very early 18th century. He's in Italy for several years before 1710, and this is the place you would go if you want to be on the leading edge of this new musical set of forms. We now call it the Baroque, as if it were a period, right? But nobody knew they were in the middle of a thing called the Baroque period at that time. In fact, even that label was a bit of an insult that later classical composers would, give to the period that came before, this rule-breaking, unruly, messy, over-the-top form of music. And for Handel, as a young man, as a late teenager and then into his 20s, this is just so incredibly exciting. Like just the most exciting musical place you can be, right? And there's a reason that when we talk about music now, we kind of break into pidgin Italian, right? Sonatas and concertos and on and on and on, and fortissimo and pianissimo and crescendo. It's because the Italians were defining the forms of sonic reality as we would come to know them. It's getting set in exactly this moment. And so that's where he really cuts his teeth as a musician and learns what it's like to be an itinerant musician and dealing with patrons, the business of music, as well as really honing his chops.
We've got a question from Kathleen, uh, who asks, she heard that the premiere was very successful in Dublin, but then received a poor reception in London, and that there was a religious objection possibly.
Yeah, that's right. So it was quite successful when it premiered on April 13th, 1742 in Dublin, and the local newspapers were rapturous about this. We know the people who were there in attendance reported this was a species of music like no other, according to a bishop who was there. But that was in a city that, of course, had a great cultural history and cultural presence, but to people from London, that was kind of considered the provinces, at the time. And once this moves to the metropolitan capital, people are less enthusiastic. And one of the things that attends it is some controversy about really what it is in its essence. So Messiah is a supremely weird piece of music. It's composed entirely of Bible verses, taken and placed seemingly at random through over the course of 2 hours and 45 minutes, if you did the entire thing, set to the conventions of Italian opera. And kind of people at the time were like, what is this thing? And am I really comfortable with the idea of sacred words being rendered as popular song, right? So it's more like Godspell in a way. It's more like Godspell than anything else. And people were like, how do I feel about that? And the religious establishment in London was really quite opposed to this. The bishops, as Jennens calls them in his letters. And Handel was so worried about this, in fact, that when it was at the first London performance, the run up to the 1743 first London performance, he didn't even call it Messiah. He just called it the Sacred Oratorio, because he was really a little bit worried that using that word was too kind of controversial. So it premiered in London in 1743. There's another performance in 1745, and then it probably would have disappeared had it not been for another set of stories that I tell in Every Valley, which has to do with an organization called the Foundling Hospital, which was an organization for indigent children that by 1749 started doing a series of annual concerts where Handel was conducting, and he decided to perform Messiah as part of a kind of a fundraising concert for the Foundling Hospital and for finishing the chapel there. And from that point on, people would kind of got used to hearing it as an annual event, and it was performed in the Foundling Hospital chapel, so it's in a religious place. And it becomes just a kind of a highlight of the social season in London. That's where most people, in fact, heard it. Benjamin Franklin heard it there in the 1750s, and he was already he referred to it in a letter as the oratorio at the Foundling Hospital. I mean, it was already so famous that Franklin didn't even have to name it, right? You knew which one he was talking about.
Can I get some clarification about how he dropped Messiah? Do
Yeah.
you think he had a sense of needing to tamp it down when he got to London, or was that after that poorly received London? And
No, this was in the run up. So people knew that there was even before it was announced, there was sort of talk that they knew what had happened in Dublin, right? So there had been reporting about this new work called Messiah in Dublin, and that Handel would quite likely perform it, in the new season in London, which would be the normal thing for him to perform a new piece of work that he had written. And he hadn't written anything new for a while, actually. So this was kind of big big news. And in the run-up, people were already starting to chatter about this. And so I think it was an effort to manage public expectation and reduce controversy. The other interesting part about that story is that there is, the old story about George II standing at the Hallelujah Chorus during the London premiere, which is allegedly the source of why we now stand by convention at the Hallelujah Chorus. It's almost certainly the case that that is untrue, and that in fact George II probably wasn't even there at the 1743 performance, because George II was doing exactly the thing that a British monarch is trained from childhood to do, which is to avoid controversy. So he would not want to go to this controversial, performance. So that tradition comes from somewhere else, certainly not from the king.
Well, we got a few more minutes. Keep those cards and letters coming. Kathleen, thanks so much for that question. Jonathan Swift, we think of as this kind of lively literary figure full of sarcasm and wit. And he almost brought down the show. We almost never saw.
He did. I mean, Swift is in this odd position of being both the person who helped enable the premiere of Messiah and the person who put up arguably the biggest obstacle to its premiere. So Jonathan Swift, by this time, having already published the thing we know as Gulliver's Travels and becoming one of the great wits of the early 18th century, by the 1740s, he was dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, one of the major cathedrals in Dublin, along with Christ Church. And Handel, in requiring choristers to perform Messiah, had hoped to get choristers from St. Patrick's. And it looked like, well, that would be the normal thing. You need a choir. There's a choir. You'll draft them in to sing. And at kind of the last minute, Jonathan Swift reneges on that agreement. And it could be because he finally figured out what was going on, that his choristers were going to sing sacred texts in a secular music hall. So this thing premiered not in one of those cathedrals, but in a rather small music hall on Fishamble Street in Dublin, a place called Neil's Music Hall. And Swift makes this announcement that he's not going to have his choristers perform in what he calls a club of fiddlers down on Fishamble Street. But the city fathers of Dublin finally intervene with him, and he allows them to participate. And so, the premiere pulls together this really ragtag group. I mean, it's choristers from two separate cathedrals. Susanna Cibber, the soloist, one of the soloists that he's drafted in, this person of great controversy because of her family background and horrible husband. And really the equivalent of kind of a military band, because most of the musicians come from the band of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Viceroy of the British King in Dublin. And they have one rehearsal that also happens to be public before the premiere on April 13th. But from some such inauspicious beginnings springs this immortal work.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Charles. It was a really wonderful tour de force, and I've been enjoying reading the book, and can't wait for to hear other people's impressions of it, and hear more as it goes out into the world and creates more conversation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been absolutely great.
Good conversation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone. I actually had a question, Charles.
Yep.
I've read a lot about Handel over the years because I like his music.
Mm-hmm.
But what is it true that he actually wrote the Messiah because he was starting to have some financial trouble? He had gotten sort of a commission kind of thing.
Yeah, well, he wasn't commissioned as such, but he was kind of at a lower point of his career. He had a lot of health troubles, not too many years before that, including some paralysis. And Handel was a person who, this was an era where you didn't have a conductor up in front of the orchestra. The conductor was essentially the harpsichordist or organist who was at the front of the group. And so Handel would be performing in every concert he was giving, but his health problems had meant that it was becoming more and more difficult for him to do that. He was quite wealthy already by the standards of the day, but he was in a bit of an artistic lull. Italian opera, the popularity of Italian opera was beginning to fall off. He was kind of at the phase where he should have been doing a greatest hits tour, you know, and otherwise I think he wouldn't have said yes so readily to going to Dublin, because it was the first time he had been there, first time he had performed there, and his friends were a little bit perplexed by why he would do this. And certainly Charles Jennens was super angry with him that he was taking the thing that Jennens had made, set it to music, and then is premiering it in Dublin and not in London. But he had this invitation, he had this opportunity, and there was some sense that he was going to kind of jumpstart his life and career at that point.
Yeah. The other question I had was about how did he adapt it so quickly? I thought, because he wasn't a religious scholar.
Yeah.
And yet he did it in how many days was it?
24 days.
24 days. I was going to say 28, and I knew that wasn't right.
Yeah, and that sounds like well, he must have thought of this piece as a very special thing in order to do it so speedily. But that was pretty much standard practice for Handel.
Yeah.
People in that era, especially if you're writing for the stage, you're constantly doing new work. You're constantly creating new things because there's no recording device that allows you to re-listen to sort of pieces of music. And folks, first of all, folks expect something new, but precisely because they can't hear a recording, you're going to recycle stuff in that new thing that you're creating. So both of those things are happening at once. And he would write entire operas in a few weeks. So there's nothing particularly special about the speed with which he wrote this one. And what the other thing that composers are doing in that period is, they have a team of copyists. So he had as many as 15 copyists, assistants, in fact, working with him. And if you look at the original manuscript, he'll occasionally do things like, he'll write a passage and then he'll say, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, effectively. And with the idea that the copyists would go back and fill in all of the stuff based on what they think he had in mind.
Kathleen
Yeah.
was going to ask a follow-up question about how did this practice of standing up during the chorus begin? Do you have any?
Yeah, well, I will tell you the best guess. So nobody knows for sure, except that it wasn't King George. It had nothing to do with King George. We know that. But the best guess is probably 1749, when he did the first concert at the Foundling Hospital. He didn't perform Messiah then. That was in the next year in 1750. But he performed a piece of music that he called the Foundling Hospital Anthem. And if you listen to the Foundling Hospital Anthem, you will immediately recognize it as a thing that we call the Hallelujah Chorus. But Handel is recycling. And of course, folks are in a church now because they're not in Neil's Music Hall in Dublin. They're at the Foundling Hospital Chapel in London, and an anthem comes on. And well, if you're in a church and an anthem is played and you're an Anglican, then the idea is that, well, that's where you stand up. And so it was probably those combination of things that had people do that. In fact, we know in plenty of other religious contexts where new music written in an anthemic style. So, for example, a coronation anthem, the idea is that you would rise for that too. This is why I say that, the Hallelujah, experiencing Messiah, including the Hallelujah chorus, is probably the most religious act that a secular audience will ever perform together, because you are doing a religious thing. And that's a much more, I think that's a historically accurate account, and it's much more interesting than the King George story.
Wow. Well, thank you, Charles. I am so awestruck by this book. We have a little clip from the community sing that was done by the Friends of Music at Guilford at Center Church last weekend, and I think that we're going to roll out on that.
Oh, I can see myself.
You can order the book from the link in the chat, and there'll be
There's Eileen.
No, I don't know. I think I know where I'm sitting.
it will support the indie bookstores. And remember, the books are the best gifts. And our next cocktail hours is on January 10th. It'll feature Lance Blythe with his new book, Ski, Climb, and Fight, the 10th Mountain Division and the Rise of Mountain Warfare. And he's an avid skier, and he talks about how they adapted recreational skiing to military skiing. So everyone have a glorious holiday season, and we'll see you again in January.
Every valley shall be exalted, shall be exalted, shall be exalted, shall be exalted. Every mountain and hill made low, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain. The crooked straight, and the rough places plain. And the rough places plain.
Was a good tenor soloist there.
That was great. You guys have a wonderful holiday, and I hope everybody gets all the books you want, because we're not giving anything else, right? Okay.
All right, thanks everyone.
And I look forward to seeing you on CBS Sunday morning. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Okay.
everyone. Thanks, bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.